So I'd now like to turn over the podium to Mark Jones. Many of you will know Mark from his work with Trailhead, with his blogs on various admin aspects and flow, for example. And Mark has recently taken up a new role as a Salesforce consultant at Time Technology. So I'd like to hand over to you, Mark, to introduce yourself and share your screen, if you would, please.
Great. No worries. Thank you very much, Paul. So let me just share my screen and we'll get that up and running. Should hopefully be able to see my screen in just a second. And let me just switch over to that window so I can see it myself. Great. So thanks again for having me, everyone. It's great to be here. This presentation we'll be doing is just a little bit around some content on flow documentation. In all transparency, you as this user group here at Cosmos are a bit of my guinea pigs for this. So I would love to hear your feedback in terms of like what you found helpful with this for future learnings. This is something I've been planning on trying to do more content on for about a year now, and so this is kind of what we're working on today. But this presentation is briefly called Epic Tips to help you create epic flow documentation. So we're going to get into that. I will try. I've got a flow to show you some examples of the points I'm going to mention. Hopefully I'll be able to show that off. I will aim to do that in the time that we've got. Just don't really necessarily need to go over necessarily who I am too much, but this is a little bit about who I am. I'm very much involved in the community as a user group leader and quite a few different other things as well. And I blog at my new blog called the Flow Architect, which is a blog specifically focused on flow. So that's a little bit about myself, so you get to know a little bit about who I am. But let's dive into what we're going to be covering today. So I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about how we can do some stuff to document our flows inside Salesforce. There's a few things that we can do. I'm also going to share about some additional documents that we can create. My hope was to have templates available in the resources for this session. Unfortunately, I'm not quite ready to share them yet, but they will be available towards the end of this month. There will be a QR code that you'll be able to see where you can scan and get access to the resources for this session, and I'll make this presentation available as well. But if you scan that QR code, I'll update that spreadsheet with the resources in over the next few weeks and include those templates in once I have them ready to a point where I'm happy for them to be shared out. Because I basically don't want you to have access to things which I don't feel are quite high quality enough yet to be shared. And then finally, I'll share my tips for creating some flow documentation. I've called it Epic Flow Documentation, but that is more just kind of a way to make the title sound more appealing and friendly. So if you have built flow documentation yourself, please do feel free to share in the chat or even in the Q&A what you have picked up from building your own flow documentation if you have. So moving on to kind of like how we can document our flows inside of Salesforce. There's quite a few different things that we can actually do inside of Salesforce to document, and the main things I would say for that is to do things like populate your description fields. And we now have description bubbles in the Spring 23 release, if you have seen that, and I'll just demo this in a brief second. We also have the ability to add inline comments to formulas and validation rules inside of Flow. And what that is just basically it's just a couple of symbols of code that you can add, where you can then add some comments in there which will not affect the calculation of the formula or the validation rule. And again, I'll show you that in a second as well. We can also create custom list views to help display and organize our flows. So if you want to have your flows grouped by object or by the type of flow, you can create list views to help you with that. And that is in a way a helpful form of kind of helping with your documentation efforts. And then the last bit I will mention, there is a really good blog about this on Automation Champion about naming conventions. But a good, really helpful methodology for working with documentation in flows is to decide upon a naming convention for API names in flows and being consistent with it where possible. And as a side note as well, it's not something I use too much for the documentation side, but you can actually report on ScreenFlow elements and orchestration work items inside of Salesforce. That is more to showcase what has been run and what has happened, rather than actually just kind of report on what flows exist. So that's something you can potentially use a little bit, but it's not something I would put so highly on the podium in terms of documenting flows. Briefly, just what I'm going to show you very quickly what those points I've just mentioned inside a Salesforce. So I'm just going to come out of the screen and go into my flow here. And you can see here, I've got an example flow that I've just been building out for testing out these code comments. And you can see, so if I was to go into this screen here, you can see I have a description I've put in there just to say that this is an example screen element. So my recommendation would be to fill in these as much as possible within your flows so that you have some good descriptions in there, and also to populate the description in your main flow settings. But if I come out here for just a second and hover over this little icon you can see to the right here, which appears when we add a description, you can see the description bubble there highlighting that. So I would personally recommend including some information about what that element is and what element is meant to be doing. Here for this demo, I've just included this as to say this is an example screen element. But if you are adding a screen element or any other element, I would include something that's a bit more describes what that element is meant to be doing inside your flow. Just briefly, just to show you as well, here's where the description is for the flow in your settings cogwheel. I haven't got a description in here for this demo, but I would recommend when you're building out flows, before you deploy them into production, ensure that you have this completed. That would be my personal advice on that. In terms of comments within formulas, if I was to come into my formula I've created for a test with comment, you can see here, and let me just zoom in a little bit so you can see the symbol. If you add in a / and a star, and then for closing to do a star and then a / you can add in comments in here. And for this, I would just simply recommend just putting in some information that is pertinent to whatever that resource is. In this case, the formula. So I've just put a simple dummy example to say if successful, this formula should display the value of 2, just to say if it's calculated successfully. So I'm going to come out of that and I will show you validation rule comments as well. So if I come back into my screen and I scroll down into my validation rules, let me just come back onto here, onto the test here, and I'm going to go to validate input. You can see here I've got a validation message. I'm just going to zoom in so you can see that a little bit better. You can see here I've got an error message to say that the date in this example should equal today. And if I scroll down to the formula, you'll see here I've got a formula here to say what the date should be, and that should be today. And if I scroll down, you can see here, just in the same way, I've added a comment in there to say what should happen with that validation rule inside of that. So that's stuff you can do inside a flow. Within that, you can also do comments like this inside of regular formula fields and standard validation rules. So you can include them in there as well. You can also include comments in Apex as well if you work with Apex at all. So let me come out of that, and I'm going to go back into my flows so you can see list views. So you can see here, I've got 2 list views that I've created. I've got a screen flows list view, and I've got a triggered flows list view. You can create these like you would with any standard list view inside a Salesforce. by just coming to your settings cog and creating new. And you can also edit and select which fields you want to add in there. You can see here all the list of the fields that we have, and you can add in any of the fields on the available side. And you can also edit your filters. So for this, I've got the process type filtered down to screen flow. So this is basically just creating a list of all of my screen flows inside of this org as well. And then the last bit that I had mentioned, if I just go back to my site, was actually going about API naming conventions. So let me just load back into my flow here that we had before. And what you can see, if I come into here, you can see here, for example, I've got an API name here. Again, I'll zoom in a little bit so you can see there. I've got the API name here. This is a variation of a naming pattern called camel case, but you can also use the standard Salesforce one as much if you like as well. The benefit I find with using a convention like where you have the, say, for example, screen first, is if I come into the toolbox, you'll be able to see that all my formulas begin with formula. And if I was to scroll down to the elements, you can see here I've got all of my input fields with input at the beginning, and I've got all of my display with display at the beginning. So it kind of groups them together in terms of how you see them organized in there. You can see the same with screens there as well. So that's a little bit of a whistle-stop tour in terms of what we can do within Salesforce. So let's come back to the slides, and I will have a look at the Q&A in just a second, if there's anything coming up. So in terms of additional documents that you maybe should consider creating, I've put down on here a strategy for how you govern your flows and your flow documentation. So having that written down somewhere would be very helpful. And really, all that needs to be, essentially, in my view, is just basically a overview of how you're going to, what's going to be in your documentation, how you're going to use that, and who's going to maintain it, and how all that kind of stuff works out. Another bit I think is quite helpful when it comes to, in terms of documentation efforts, is a scheduled flow calendar. If you've used scheduled flows before, you'll know you can set up them to run either just once, or you can set them up to run daily or weekly, and you can set up the times that you have. A scheduled flow calendar can be a very helpful thing. It's just basically would be a list of when each flow is scheduled to run. That can be in a Word document, or I've also done it in a Google Calendar before. So you can just have a calendar on there where you can see which flows are meant to run when, and that can give you an opportunity to track when your scheduled flows are due to run. Another one for me, I think is a good idea, is a flow change log. So what I would recommend in terms of how you document your flow overall is have a document per flow where you go into what the flow is, what its purpose is, what business problems it solves, and at the end of that document have a change log. And that is basically the whole idea for that would be just to track when changes have been made, who has made them, and if you have a requirement where you want your changes to your flows approved, who signed off on those changes. You might not need to have that sign off on there, but basically a change log will be looking for what's changed, who changed it, and when was it changed, as well as tracking the version number as well. And then the last bit I've got in here, which is something I wish I had the template of to show you to hand, is what I'm referring to as a flow glossary. And in that's kind of a resource I would have at the end of your document, where basically you list out your variables and your resources that you want to have in that document to cover what's included in there and explain it. And it doesn't have to be massively rocket science, I don't think, on that. But what you want to see with that is, say, if you've got, for example, a formula in there that calculates, you can have that in there, like you saw in that example. Or you could have your record variables and things like that. Just a list of what resources you have in your flow that you feel needs to be included in that document. And I mentioned before, I'd recommend adding them at the end of your main document for the flow. One other document which I haven't added on this list, which I think is potentially a good idea as well, is just a singular document, which would just be a list of all of your flows, and then to hyperlink that to all of your documents that you create for your individual level documents for each flow. And that can also include a link to your schedule flow calendar if you go down that route. So that's additional documents I would consider creating. I will have templates to say towards the end of this month for these things that you will be able to see, and I'll be sharing them in that resources spreadsheet you'll get to see in just a little bit. In terms of the tips for myself, and I'd love to hear if anybody has any different views on this, but for me, what I would recommend is to not overcomplicate things. With flow, it can be very easy to get probably into some of the weeds, maybe a little bit too much, going through all of the little minute details in the flow. But your flow documentation, for it to be the most benefit, should really kind of explain what the automation is doing, why it's needed, and what business problems it solves. The technical level stuff, generally speaking, would probably be more read by admins, consultants, those people who would be working on maintaining the flow, generally speaking. So while I think there's a place for that information for sure, you don't necessarily want to overcomplicate the document by going into every little tiny detail necessarily. But that's a decision that you would want to make. I've also put down about snapshotting your canvas and your elements. Basically, by just mean screenshots and put them into those documents. If you write documentation on anything, you'll know that images can be very, very helpful in that, in terms of explaining what's going on within whatever you're documenting. In terms of descriptions, keeping them clear and concise. And by that, I just simply mean you're having it so that you can read that and you can understand what that particular item you're describing is, whether that's a variable, whether that's a formula, or an element, or anything else inside the flow that you add descriptions to, just so you can have it clear and that it makes sense to whoever will be looking at that flow. Labels as well, that's a bit of a thing I've gone back and forth on in the last year, largely because of Slack, if I'm honest. But I'm kind of more towards the train of keeping your labels relatively short but descriptive, so that you can have a look at them and you can understand straight away what that thing is meant to be. So, for example, if you haven't say an update element, having the codes update and then whatever you're updating. So if it's say updating contacts or updating related contacts or something like that, those are potentially good examples of labels for elements inside of a flow, in my opinion. And as well as you build out your documentation, keeping in mind specific items relating to different flow types. So we talked about that before about scheduled triggered flows. So that would be when it triggers on the schedule. For things like record trigger flows, you'd be looking at things like the trigger order for that, if you're using trigger order, which is something I would also recommend for record triggered flows. And also be mindful and document any potential impact that the flow will have. So when we build any automation, it can have a knock-on impact on potentially other automations. There's things like Apex triggers inside of your org. It can also impact other flows and potentially other integrations. So if you are able to document that is very, very helpful in there. And then the last two bits, make a note of your flow version. I think that is quite an important one because, as you might be aware, there is a limit of 50 versions per flow at the moment. So if you build a flow, the maximum limit is 50 flows, 50 versions of that flow. So when you get to say 49 versions, you'll probably want to consider taking away some of those older versions that aren't active anymore. And as well, in the documentation, as simple as it sounds, know why it's needed and what business problem it solves. At the end of the day, when we build automation, the idea for us is that we would be building it to solve a business problem that the organizations that we are building them for are dealing with. So you want to basically know why the flow was needed and what it solves. So those are my overall tips for creating documentation, just to kind of share towards before we move into the questions. I do have this resources slide, as I mentioned before. This is a Google Sheet with some resource links on there, and I will be continuing to populate that over the next number of weeks, as I mentioned, just so you can get those templates I've mentioned that aren't quite ready yet. And also there's some other blogs I've included in that as well. So I'll leave it up for a second, just give people just a quick chance to scan that. And then I will move on to my final bit, which is a little bit of selfish promotion. Over the course of this month, I'm going to be putting together a blog each week on documentation on this topic. And the first blog is out, came out today, came out just about an hour or so ago. And then there's going to be a new post each week going forward until the end of the month. Next week, I'm going to be talking a bit about what you've seen a little bit tonight, about what you can use inside of Salesforce to document your documentation efforts. And then we'll be kind of going through a few other topics towards the end of the month. And with that, just want to say a big thank you, and just to see if there's any questions. So let me just have a quick look